Guys, Marcus, it's the FlowPoint Podcast again. I don't know the number, and this is pretty informal, but I wanted to get to some of the email questions and comments that I've been getting for the last couple of weeks or months, actually. Finally got some time to take a look at some of the stuff you guys have been sending me. It's been really good. I'm not going to get to all of it, and there's a lot of good input, and I really appreciate it, so keep it coming. I'm going to answer, a lot of people have been talking about or asking for some technical questions or answers rather. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. It's going to be 15 minutes, maybe. Before I get to that though, new FlowPoint TV episode is coming out next Tuesday. So I think there's a little confusion, and it's my fault because podcasts usually aren't video, but as you can see, I'm doing podcasts not only in the audio format on iTunes, but in this video format here on YouTube. And I think that's confusing people because the podcasts are kind of a completely different thing, very raw, as you can see by this right here, and very unproduced. Whereas the FlowPoint TV episodes, what I started with, are usually very, try to make them polished and clean and nice looking. So that's what's coming out next Tuesday, a whole nother episode. It's going to be part one of a kind of a two-part series that covers what we did. HO Skis and myself and a bunch of buddies went to South America in February, actually. So I put a teaser out yesterday on Instagram. Today it's going to go on Facebook, so check that out. And if you haven't seen any of the other FlowPoint TV episodes, go to the YouTube channel, FlowPoint, and check them out. So also, I have another FlowPoint interview that I'm probably going to post at some point from last year at Nationals in Idaho. And it's about my friend Bruce, who's from the Midwest, 81 years old, jumped 101 feet. And just to give you a little bit of a kind of a teaser at why he's such a cool guy to talk to, this is from his nephew, Craig Gates. And he sent me an email. He said, "You got to interview my uncle. He jumped 101 feet at 81 years old. He grew up so poor that they burned corn in a stove to survive in a one-room shack with 5 kids. His dad passed away from pneumonia at a young age. 15 miles to town in a horse buggy, took all day. He hustled pool in high school to support the family." So that's pretty ridiculous resume right there from Bruce, and that was like 70 years ago. So he's an interesting character, I can say that. And he's always at every Nationals. I think he's probably been to more Nationals than anybody else still alive. I totally made that up, but it could be totally legit. Pretty amazing dude. So I got some cool interview stuff from last year that I will share at some point in the FlowPoint podcast. So technique stuff, just real quick. So this gets kind of, I always say that, just real quick. I'm gonna figure out how to stop saying that. Sorry about the echo. I'm in my dock, under my dock, so it sounds like we're in a tin can. So Northrop Johnston asked a couple questions. I don't have my counterpart, Terry Winter, right here to answer these with, but we are going to talk about a few things. He says, "Why is hip mobility important to skiers?" And this is a thing I get asked often, and people usually think when I say hip mobility, I think that's because I want them to really contort their bodies and do this weird twist where they separate their hips and their shoulders and they really rotate their spine and bend and drop their butt. The reality is that's not what I want people to do at all. The reality is, if I can find something as a prop, maybe my phone case, let's try that. The reality is hip mobility is good because the more hip mobility you have, the better opportunity you have to save your spine. So if this is your back right here, this is your spine, okay? And let's say your hip is this bottom point. So if your hips have mobility and your legs are coming in, this is really, really technical, guys, then your upper body can move relative to your hips. We're talking about hinging forward and back and also rotating side to side, or rotating about your legs. So if you don't have hip mobility, say this joint right here doesn't bend, then let's grab it like this. Something else has to bend. At some point, you're going to get stressed. Something else, some other part of your body has to bend. Can you see that? It looks like a low back. braking, bending, trying to brake, okay? And if this upper part of your back, let's say right here, is too stiff, then your low back is gonna bend if your hips can't move. So the whole importance about hip mobility, and actually this goes for shoulder mobility too, as I slump forward, the whole purpose for these joints is full range of motion. I have pretty much the opposite of full range of motion, which is probably why I have stiff upper back, stiff lower back. So back to the question, why is hip mobility important? Hip mobility is important so that your spine doesn't have to twist and your spine doesn't have to bend and flex, local flexion, my buddy Kelly Starrett calls it, because that's when injuries happen. When you stress your spine at a certain point, that's when injuries happen. So shoulder mobility is key, but also hip mobility. And there's some really good stuff. If you go to mobilitywod.com, it's my buddy Kelly Starrett. Other people are doing ROMWOD. Basically just trying to stretch and regain some of the motion that your joints were designed to perform. And actually it's what you used to have when you were like 5, before you stopped moving so much, and when you started sitting in school chairs. So that's hip mobility and why it's so important. Separation of upper body and lower body. This is kind of a concept along the lines of hip mobility, but it's kind of a fallacy in thinking. So the bottom line is, what I want people to realize, the most effective way to ski, or what we would call, people are starting to call it different things, but what we used to call West Coast slalom, is an examination of where your center of mass is at a certain place, at a certain time, how you're accepting the loads from the boat, and what kind of rhythm you establish to perpetuate what you want, which is an early line, a super rhythmic flow, and hopefully a rhythm that lines up with the course so that you don't get later and you don't get too early and go inside of a buoy. Talking about center mass shift, the best way to shift your center mass is by using your body properly. Now, some people end up not being able to use their hips, not having hip mobility, not having ankle flexion, whether it's because their ankles are actually stiff or their boots don't allow their ankles to flex and their knees to go forward. So no matter what the reason, most people end up in kind of a hips back, or I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. I'll say hips centered position. So hips kind of centered between your feet. Now the problem is that doesn't always cut it. And in situations where you're coming off of a turn, you grab the handle with your second hand and it's time to accelerate, if your hips aren't moving in the direction that you need to go, then what happens is your upper body isn't going to move that direction either. So what ends up happening is people compensate by dipping their shoulders towards the wake, or by rotating their shoulders towards the next buoy, all in an effort, indirectly, they don't really know, most skiers don't know this, but it's all in an effort to get their mass moving in the direction that they want to go, to create acceleration. So the problem with not having hip mobility, and the problem with people trying to think about upper body, lower body separation, because maybe back in the day they thought that's what Terry and I were doing. I'll back up. Terry and I, back in the day, by the way, Terry's skiing unbelievable, best of his life. He comes here and he skis really well. I don't need to say what he does, but it's the best he's ever skied. And one of the things that he's doing really well is he's not getting crushed under the load of the boat. And he's not separating his upper body and his lower body. Contrary to what we used to do back when I was skiing competitively, people thought we were trying to really twist our shoulders open to the boat and keep our hips facing the direction we were going. And that's not the reality. Maybe that's what we were actually doing, but there's a difference between do as I say and do as I do. And that's something I want to really drive home, because we all know some of the best coaches in the world aren't the best athletes in their sport, and some of the best athletes in their sport definitely aren't some of the best coaches. So it goes to show that when you look at somebody, and I do this myself too, and we say, "Oh my gosh, why am I going to listen to them? Look at how they play football, or look at how they, perform on the water." But you can't really use that as justification. Just because somebody isn't the caliber of skier that you aspire to be, doesn't mean, or because they don't ski like you want to ski, doesn't mean that they don't have something good to say that's actually factual, that's actually rooted in physics, that might help you with your skiing. So point is, Terry and I didn't used to always ski how we tried to coach. And the separation of upper body and lower body, where people think that the hips need to be doing one thing and the shoulder should be doing another thing, that's totally wrong. Unfortunately, it's a misconception of what we were trying to do. And I use the analogy of bending over and twisting to pick something up. We all know that's bad. You don't want to bend over and then twist your spine and then try to pick something up, because for you kids, you don't really care right now, but you will care someday. For the older people, we know that that's a recipe for disaster and a back blowout. That's why we don't want to separate the upper body and the lower body. And that's why precisely we want to work on hip mobility, because hip mobility will allow us some slack. Our legs end up acting like a clutch. So our ski can be doing one thing and our hips can be doing slightly something else. So on our toe side cut, our hips can be migrating towards open to the boat. Yes, that's a good thing. On our heel side cut, our hips are naturally already open to the boat, but they can open up to the boat more. So the degree to which you can rotate your hips relative to your feet is directly related to the degree to which you can increase your dynamic acceleration and increase your ability to accept higher loads from the boat. Yes, that's a good thing once you know how to do it, and therefore increase your ability to become a better skier. So upper body, lower body separation is kind of a myth insofar as it's not really what we want to try to do, but people still do it. I still do it even though I'm skiing 34 miles an hour and 28 off. It still happens. But it's not a goal. It's not an objective. And I think the more we realize that we want our core, our shoulders and our hips and everything in between to be facing the same direction, relatively speaking, throughout the whole pass, the better. Just spouting off here. Oh, why is core strength important? Same reason, right? If you can't maintain the shape of your spine under load, or even just when you're standing, you notice people standing, and I talked about stripper butt a long time ago, but we all tend to kind of hang on our bones, as Kelly would say, instead of activating, firing, and keeping everything kind of in balance so that we're not overextended and we're not overflexed in our spine. And so if you have a strong core and you work on that and you have mobile hips, chances are you're going to have a lot less back problems and a lot less chance of injury. Other question, why do most pros open their hips and shoulders to down course these days? So I don't know if most pros do. I know a lot of pros do, but I think a lot of pros are also trying to do other stuff, from what I understand, just bits and pieces. Some people are trying to face the next buoy. So they turn one ball and they're trying to face buoy number 2. And I would disagree with that. I would tend to think, in everything that I've learned and everything that I've coached and all the successes that I've had personally and with students, I would say that the degree to which, like we talked about, you can get your hips somewhat open or down course, we call it. In snow skiing, they call it down the fall line. The degree to which you can do that will directly correlate to more dynamic shift into the wakes. And I keep saying dynamic shift, and what I mean by that is having your body stacked over your feet so that when the load comes from the load from the boat actually propels you inward toward the wake, instead of the load from the boat adding to the load on your feet, but just pulling you down course. So there's a difference between skidding down course like this and actually having your ski on a trajectory where it's more or less tracking. And it can never really fully track because we're in a medium that's, low viscosity? I don't know, I can't remember my engineering. But basically, we're always sliding, okay? We're always skidding at some point. But the lighter you can be out of the turn into the wakes, and the more stacked you can be, the more dynamic shift you can get, the faster you're gonna be with less load. The whole name of the game is quick acceleration in the center line with low load. My whole mechanism with which to do that isn't just about opening the hips and the shoulders, but it's about the arm load. It's about which arm is taking the load. A lot of people want to go lead arm. I think you've got to have a certain amount of even load or approaching more even load through both arms. Now, if you have to twist your spine on your offside cut to get the load even so that your shoulders and your hips are relatively open to the boat, that's bad. Okay, don't do that. If you don't have the hip mobility to open your hips and your shoulders at the same rate, probably work till you get to that stopping point and don't try to go anymore with your shoulders, because then your spine's twisting too much, and we know how that works out. But the whole goal is evening the torque coming from the boat on your body. So if you're watching me from the boat and I'm a skier and I have the load coming directly into my chest, okay, so the resultant force from the rope is coming directly into my chest, and I'm accelerating towards the wake, and I'm increasing the load on the rope, and the rope is approaching 400 or 500 pounds of load, there is zero net torque trying to twist me out towards the buoy or twist me in towards the boat. So what that does is that frees me to get the most amount of dynamic shift, or the most amount of mass over my front foot into the wakes. Because we all know that if you're getting twisted, if you're in a tug of war and you have more load on this arm, you're getting twisted, or too much on this arm, you're getting open back up, your chances are you're not going to be able to resist, and you're not going to be able to have the amount of latitude to move fore and aft with your center of gravity relative to your feet. So to keep it simple, if you have too much lead arm pressure into the wakes, ultimately you have a torque on your body that's trying to pull you open to the boat. And what happens is, a lot of times more beginner or intermediate skiers that on their offside cut end up hopping the wakes, and when they hop, their ski twists in the air, and then when they land, sometimes it has to reset and kind of recalibrate and point back out towards the buoy. Anybody out there ever have that happen? It's a really scary thing, and sometimes it doesn't end well. People catch tips, catch edges, and go out the front in that scenario. Well, the whole reason that's happening is because they're completely lead arm dominant. And what happens is, when they launch off the wakes at center line at 22 off or whatever, the boat in the air, there's no way the ski can resist this rotation that the boat is imparting on them, so they get twisted open to the boat. The exact thing they're trying to keep from doing, getting pulled to the boat, happens in the air because there's no way to resist it. And the ski twists and almost face the boat, and when it lands, it has to reset. So to avoid that, and to use that as an example of what we really should be trying to do, the name of the game should be trying to even the load, lead arm, trail arm, 50% of the load on each arm, ideally, so that going into the wakes on your acceleration, there's no net rotation or torque from the boat that's trying to twist you outbound or twist you open to the boat. And people really think, a lot of people I hear, when they think open to the boat, they think they're giving up. They're giving up everything to the boat. And the whole problem with that thinking is it doesn't really hold water when you break it down to the fundamental components of skiing and how skiing works. So if you want to increase your acceleration into the wakes, which I think you do, because that's going to get you to the wakes quicker and it's going to give you more space before the next buoy, the name of the game is getting in a stacked position. So the shape of your body needs to be stacked, hips over front foot, shoulders over hips, and you need to be moving dynamically into the wakes. And the safest, most reproducible way I know how to do that is trying to approach 50% of the load on each arm into the wakes, because that evens out the torque on your body so that there's no rotational torque imparted from the rope, and it gives you the best chance to get stacked and to create a high acceleration position with low load. Then from center line out, it's okay to use the lead arm. That's when you want to use the lead arm, not into the wakes on the acceleration phase, but from center line out, that's when you want to rely on your lead arm pressure or your down arm or whatever people like to call it, because that's what's going to allow you to control the rate of the edge change, meaning slowing it down, and it's also going to allow you to control your ski's desire to get completely outbound towards shore. Because the quicker your ski goes outbound towards shore, the more problems you're going to have and the more energy you just gave up from the boat. But that's a whole nother discussion. So we're going to keep it short and sweet. That's it. I'm going to get to more, and I'm going to have more guests on again. Like I said, next week, no FlowPoint Podcast, because there's going to be a FlowPoint TV episode. If you haven't seen the teaser, go to my Instagram account or go to my Facebook page, the FlowPoint TV Facebook page today, as I'm getting ready to post it as soon as I sign off here. Thanks, guys. Talk to you soon.